we wanted to pose a question to, I guess, the community first, and I guess this is what we're sort of seeing in the market right now. That um, currently, everybody in Australia and New Zealand, since lockdown, if you're an office worker and you can do your work from home, everybody's working from home. But I guess now the focus is starting to change to one, how long this is going to take to what the new normal looks like. I've seen a lot of articles recently about maybe a staggered start for employees. Do we have split shifts and people working 1 day a week or 3 days a week? Um, so what is the future of remote working, and what are the solutions going to look like? What policies will persist and or will be back as quickly as possible to the new normal? I guess, we're starting to have these discussions with our customers, and I'm hoping, was wondering, hopefully through this session we can see from yourselves if you're having these discussions internally. Now that you have everything enabled, are you looking at a long-term strategy, and what changes do you think you'll make? And then we're kind of starting to see, when people are asking these questions, what are the barriers? And, overcoming cultural resistance is key. I know personal experience, I've worked from home usually a couple of days a week, and you get the terms inside of the office sometimes, oh, you're a slacker or you're a part-timer. Some of the people that have been, maybe, we call it old school thinking, was that they always wanted people in the office 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And, this has challenged them to say that people are still productive working from home, and people are sometimes working even more hours or doing more when they're working from home. I know my hours have definitely got longer since working from home. There's no lunch breaks, there's no coffee breaks. You're generally working a lot harder. And then once they've started to do this, some of the questions are: did our remote working technology meet our current requirements, or did we, sort of band-aid things together to make it work? And if this is the new normal, what do we need to do to make this more possible? We've seen some things, with Zoom's uptake and other technology around collaboration being enhanced. How are we going to manage a person working from home? Things like asset management. How are we going to onboard a new user? How do we offboard a person once they leave the organization? Do we have to send them a satchel to return their equipment? Now, these are sort of all the new talking points that people are starting to consider, because this wasn't ever anticipated that your entire workforce will be working from home. And I think lastly has been around company policies and procedures. How does OH&S impact ergonomics? Do you need to send out screens so people can have dual screens? Do you need to have a look at how they're sitting in their desks? What policy do you have if you say, well, I'm working from home 2 days a week or 3 days a week? Do I have to sign a timesheet, log in and log out to show that I'm still working 40 hours or whatever my contract says? And how these policies get enacted inside of organizations. I think, these are all questions. We don't have the answers to all of these, but it's interesting discussions we've been having with our customers that are now looking at the future and what this might be. As we can all tell, the current situation, we don't know whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. Nobody quite knows. So people are starting to think long-term now of how they can make this the new norm, potentially, or what does the new norm look like? One of the things that we wanted to share with you is a current story from Amazon. People ask us on a daily basis, how do we do this? And we wanted to share with you, some key things that we've done inside of Amazon, not just AWS. So Amazon globally has a large user base, and we had a lot of contractors as well worldwide that are coming into the organization, and they needed to quickly onboard new employees and other parts of the business. Before the current situation, we already had 25,000 users using Workspaces, and they were not longer shipping machines to these people. They were logging in remotely. And we manage our 25,000 user base through 3 people. So there's 3 IT people dedicated to look after Workspaces globally. Currently now that number's gone up, and I haven't got the latest number. And what we've seen is that a new user coming into the organization, so within our AWS in Australia and New Zealand, we are still onboarding users at a rapid, new employees at a rapid rate. All those new users are using BYOD, and they're getting a Workspaces to log into the environment. So they get provisioned through Active Directory, their username and password is assigned, and then they get some instructions to how to download the client and log in. So we're currently onboarding everybody through Workspaces. And then in the future, that they might get a device shipped out to them. They may look at using theirs more and not have a device if they don't need it. But the first instance for all our users is to get a Workspaces currently in our environment. And I would love to get the stat. Hopefully, I can get that soon. But a previous stat was 25,000 users using it, Workspaces, and managed by 3 people globally. We still use all our system management tools. We still use Active Directory to manage Workspaces, and we still apply group policies and security. But we also have a zero trust model. So if you are using BYOD, we don't worry about the device you're using as long as we can install a Workspaces client on that device.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Rich. So as I mentioned in the opening, we've got 4 services that we broadly talk about when we're talking to our customers about the AWS End User Compute story. Workspaces or Amazon Workspaces, it's what's classified as a desktop as a service. I like to call it a desktop as an API, which kind of leaves and hopefully will start to fill your imagination with some of the really cool things that you can do with a desktop as an API. Whoops, go back
Sorry,
a slide,
yeah.
Rich. The second service quickly talk about is Amazon AppStream 2.0. So AppStream is a way to securely deliver your application to your end user through a web browser, which is a very interesting discussion point for a lot of customers. So we see really good use cases with that around things like SaaSifying. I'm going to trademark this term, SaaSifying your legacy application and exposing it to your users, and they can consume it through a browser. A really cool example is SAP GUI. As an example, for those that are familiar with SAP GUI, perhaps you might be rolling or have rolled it out to your many PCs or your many endpoints. It's actually one of the biggest things that customers say with that is it's really hard to manage and maintain SAP GUI. It's heavily version dependent between the front end and the back end. If you do a minor upgrade on the back end, you then need to roll out the application to all of your endpoints or devices again. So what we're seeing customers do is actually roll it out into AppStream. It's one install, you manage it in one place, and then all of your users just consume that through a web browser. So that's a really interesting use case. The other interesting use case for AppStream is the very high end. So things like high end 3D visualizations, geospatial applications, oil and gas applications, things like fluid dynamic applications. We've got many universities that use really high end applications inside of AppStream, and they consume it. All of their students, if virtual labs, just consume it through a web browser, and they just pay for the cost per hour of the actual underlying AppStream instance, which is very interesting. A lot of customers are throwing away those super high-end PCs and reverting to this because they find that they actually only need the high-end capacity for a very limited period of time, that the user is not in there 24/7, that there's no reason to have that heavy workstation at their desk anymore. WorkDocs is our file sharing collaboration platform. It enables customers or end users to share and collaborate on files securely within their organization, and also it enables them to share those documents externally with their third party, perhaps their end customers or third parties as well. Amazon WorkLink, it's not something we typically talk about too much in the APAC region. It is not available in the APAC region right now, but it is a way to securely deliver your website to your end users on a mobile device. And all we're doing is streaming the pixels down to the actual mobile device. So when your user right now goes to a web page on their mobile phone, it obviously leaves things like a local cache behind on that mobile phone. So what we're doing is removing the actual need to use a browser on the actual mobile phone device, and they just consume it through a secure streaming channel, and there's no footprint left on that device once the user's closed the application, which is very interesting to some of our customers. So let's rip the covers off the Amazon Workspaces service, and apologies, this is a very busy slide. We normally step customers through in an animated fashion, so my apologies. But the intent of this slide is to just show you what we're managing on your behalf as a managed service offering with Workspaces. A lot of these things, if you're running a legacy VDI solution, you would have to manage and maintain a lot of these things yourself. Obviously, a lot of skills you would need to have inside your business to manage and maintain this. So we're managing and maintaining all of these things on your behalf as part of a managed service offering. So let's kind of go into some of these things. I won't go into too much depth because we're conscious of time, but just wanted to give you guys a bit of a taste as to what's actually under the hood. So on the far left-hand side, you have your customer site. You have your users. Your users could be physically within your premises. They could be at home. In the most recent, obviously, the current situation we face ourselves in, your users are remote. They're having to work from home. So all we need is a public internet connection. The North Star for the Amazon EUC services is access from anywhere on any device. So they're all public services. As long as you have an internet connection, you're good to go. The bottom left-hand side is typically your corporate on-premise data center. So this is where things like your Active Directory instances or virtual machines would reside, things like your DNS services, SCCM if you're doing app packaging deployment, database services, or any other supporting services for your users inside of their workspace. So think of a workspace as the user's desktop environment that they are connected to. On the right-hand side, we've got a lot of things. We've got the AWS Cloud, where we're talking about the Sydney region. We have, funnily enough, obviously you guys are all in New Zealand. We have some very, very large customers in New Zealand. Latency is not a thing for New Zealand back to the AWS Sydney region for Workspaces. We've got, again, many, many customers that run their workspaces and have their users connected via things like 4G modems out in remote fields. So that's very interesting to a lot of customers. In the top level of the AWS environment is managed. So this is things that we're managing on your behalf as part of our managed service offering. And then the bottom tier is things that is in your control. So this is your AWS account, your VPCs, which is a virtual private cloud or virtual network construct you set up. And inside of that is your subnets and availability zones. So quick walkthrough of some of the flows that the user would have to go through. As Rich mentioned, we've got Workspaces clients available. The user would download the Workspaces client. We've got available for Windows, Mac, Android, Chromebooks, iOS, pretty much any device down to a 10-inch screen. We intentionally make that a requirement of larger than 10-inch screen because our North Star with this service is to produce a good end user experience, and we did not do that by delivering on a smaller than 10-inch screen. So that is by design limitation that we put there. So the user would download and install the Workspaces client on their physical PC. They would enter a registration code on the Workspaces client. That points that particular installation at the AWS region and also the specific directory to consume. Also, once the user opens the client, enters the username, password, and optional MFA. If you want to enable MFA, we support Radius platforms to enable MFA, and there's a bunch of plugins for Radius that enable connectivity to a bunch of MFA services. Big ones we see in region are things like Okta MFA, Geo MFA, and there's a bunch. There's a bunch of different plugins for Radius. So the user obviously has to authenticate. So username, password, that is passed via HTTPS channel. So it's all encrypted with TLS 1.2. That is passed through to something called an AD connector. So AD connector is one of 3 directory service choices that you can use as part of the Workspaces offering. AD connector is what most customers use because they want to plug Workspaces into their existing Active Directory solution. So the AD connector just proxy relays the authentication request back into the customer's actual Active Directory. That could be back on premise if you have things like a direct connect or a VPN solution to connect AWS with your data center. A lot of customers also choose to deploy their Active Directory into the AWS cloud, so either self-managed on EC2 or with something called a managed Active Directory. So once the user's authenticated into their Workspaces platform, the actual streaming session starts. So the streaming process is, we've actually licensed a third-party protocol. It's called Teradicci PC over IP. That uses a very particular port number of 4172, and the streaming session starts. The Workspace instance itself is running in a managed environment again. We're managing the infrastructure on your behalf. All we're doing is streaming the actual inputs and outputs of the user's session back to the actual PC that they're connected to. And we place for both the AD connector or directory service and the Workspace instance, we place the network adapter into the customers or your VPCs. And this enables you to then access any other resource inside of AWS or again, resource back on premise through things like the Direct Connect service. Quickly talk about operating system choices. So we've got actually two flavors of operating system you can choose to run. The first is Windows Server 2016, which gives you the Windows 10 desktop experience. So most customers choose to run that. The second choice is run Amazon Linux 2, which is the Linux variant for Workspaces. This has a desktop experience pack called Mate, or if you're an Aussie, prefer your Aussieisms, Mate. There's a desktop, it's an open source desktop. The third option is to bring your own desktop operating system into Workspaces. So that's the third option you can choose to use there. Quickly talk about Zero Trust. So we've got many customers that roll out BYOD or bring your own device. This is where they do not trust the PCs that are connecting into the Workspace. Obviously, the user still has their username, password, and MFA code that they type into the Workspaces client. But at that point, they are connecting to a secure desktop environment. So this is exactly what Amazon does for our corporate desktop. So Richard spoke about the Amazon corporate use case for Workspaces, and this is exactly what we use. So right now, I am sitting at my personal Mac, and I am connected to my corporate PC. And that corporate PC just happens to be the Workspaces desktop in the cloud, which is super cool. So you can also control, if you're security sensitive or security aware, you might want to control things that come out of the Workspaces client onto the physical PC. So things like clipboard copy and printer redirection, you can 100% control and disable those things if you don't want those to be able to get down to the endpoints through data loss controls. So that's a lot of speaking from me about what's under the hood. I hope I've given you a bit of a quick glimpse as to what our customers love about the Workspaces solution, being it's a fully managed desktop in the cloud. So I think we have a bit of a poll as the next slide. Rich, you able to jump into that next slide?
I was going to, but there was a question that was posted, Phil. Is Windows
awesome.
Server 2016 for Workspace provide Windows client interface? What about the license costs?
Yep, absolutely. So good questions, both. No, two different questions. So answer the first one. Yes, so we install, it's obviously Windows Server 2016. We install what's called the Desktop Experience Pack or Desktop Experience Mode on top of that to make it look and feel exactly like a Windows desktop operating system. For most users that they think that this is actually a desktop they're connecting to, there's very little of the way of actual difference between those two things. The biggest emission from the Windows Server operating environment is the Microsoft Storefront. So this is where customers or end users can download or purchase, download and install Microsoft desktop applications through the Microsoft Storefront. Not a lot of enterprise customers want that to happen anyway, but there's one of the major differences between a desktop and a server operating system. The second question was around licensing. As part of our license model with Windows Server, we are bundling in the Microsoft license as part of the package. you see one fee from us as a Workspaces cost. You don't see all of the other subcharges that are hidden underneath it all as a managed service offering. So you can consume that either as a fixed cost per user per month. So a lot of customers just like having a known price, X dollars per user per month. Alternatively, if it's a light user use case, so an example is an occasional access, perhaps I need nighttime access for my developers to do jump box work or random ad hoc kind of work inside of my environment, then they can also choose, or you can also choose to use pay by the hour, which is very interesting to a lot of customers. There is a balance point though. If your users connected more than 83 hours in a month typically, then it is more cost effective to have a fixed monthly price. And we've also got a cost optimizer tool that can help automate the changeover between an always on and an auto stop or an hourly based instance, so that it's running as the most cost effective price mode for you. So I hope that helps to answer those two questions there. Any other questions on the channel, Rich?
Yeah, so Phil, you kind of started talking about Craig's question, but maybe just we'll dive in a little bit deeper here. His question from Craig was, pricing indicates one option that includes a monthly flat fee and an hourly fee.
Yep.
Are you able to schedule the workspace's uptime, or is that controlled by the client triggering the workspace to a startup?
Yes, I hope I've answered the first part of that question around flat user fee versus an hourly based consumption model. If your workspace is running hourly, you can absolutely, as I said before, it's desktop as an API, so you can either through the management console or API script it so that the workspace starts at a particular time. But my question would be, why would you want to do that, given that you're paying by the hour? You only want this thing running for when your user really needs it and really wants it, being they're trying to connect to us. So if it is an auto stop instance or pay by the hour, what we do is perform a Windows Hibernate behind the scenes, which takes everything out of the memory and sticks it into the Windows Hibernate files on disk. It stops the underlying instance, so therefore you don't pay. And then when the user tries to connect or reconnect to that particular workspace that has stopped, it needs to start itself up, take everything back out of disk and put it back into memory. And that takes a little bit of time. It's normally about 90 seconds is the start time for those things. I just put a little bit of a caveat is that can depend based on the group policies that you apply as part of your Active Directory solutions. So it's about 90 seconds for a startup.
Thanks, Phil. Craig, hopefully that answered your question. And Raza, if they didn't, please type in more questions. We'll answer them as we go. I can move on, or does anybody have any other questions before we move on to the poll?
There was one from Matt about browser. All we got is browser. So just confirming. So we normally recommend customers install a thick client for Workspaces. This unlocks a bunch of functionality, things like multi-monitor support, local printer redirection capabilities, and obviously seamless clipboard. With a thick client, we can do a lot more interesting things. We do have a client available for browser, so there's nothing to actually install inside your browser. You just connect to your workspace through a special web endpoint that you're given for your directory. The one caveat to that is it's not a really good user experience. So yes, you can absolutely do it, but it is not a good user experience because you lose out on those really nice features, things like multi-monitor support, clipboard redirection, and local printer redirection as well.
So let's build this out real quick. So primarily people were using Workspaces for specific use cases. And we touched on a couple of these before, but like contractors coming into the organization, third party, whether they're long-term contractors or third parties doing consulting work, they were enabling Workspaces so they didn't have to provide them a PC or a laptop to use. Remote employees, as you can see, we're all remote now, but that was one of them. Mergers and acquisitions was also something where they wanted to onboard a business directly and quickly or and efficiently. And specialized apps, I think Phil touched on it as well. You know, we've got lots of customers that have high 3D rendering graphics applications that instead of buying bulky machines that sit on the people's desks, they started using Workspaces for that, as well as wholesale VDI replacements. So as customers move into the AWS cloud, they would look at these VDI on-premise hardware solutions and say they wanted to buy more native solutions from AWS and replace their hardware offering that they currently have on-prem, and they would replace it. And then obviously business continuity. So a lot of BCP plans weren't built around what's happening today. It was built around, specific users needing access to the environment to continue to work. But as you can see, because Workspaces fits across all those use cases, why not enable Workspaces for entire workforce? Why not make this the new normal where people were to access Workspaces for being a contractor or a specialized application or remote worker, and to enable business continuity? The reason why, Workspaces, as we touched on, it is a managed service, but user experience is always paramount for us. We do a one-to-one desktop mapping. So our users are a persistent desktop, and it's a one-to-one mapping. We don't do pooled or shared resourcing. So if you were to give a user 2 CPUs and 4 gig of memory, that's the exact what the user gets. And Phil, who works harder than me, gets another machine that's 4 CPUs and 8 gig of memory. That's exactly what he gets. And Phil's work won't impact my work in any way, shape, or form because of persistent desktop. Agility and scalability. So we have Workspaces instances around the world. We have customers right now, especially in BPO or business processing offices all throughout Asia, accessing a region in Singapore, their corporate data centers in our Sydney region, and accessing Workspaces across those 2 environments so they can scale. They can have agility to deploy these anywhere they like. And cost optimization, like there's some of the questions around, we bill per hour. So if your contractors are coming in only for 2 hours a day, you can bill them per hour of consumption. Whereas, your hardworking employees that are there 8 to 9 hours a day, then, you give them a monthly workspace. So we look at all that. And we've got a cost optimization tool which lets you look at that and review that and ensure that you've got the right configuration for your users. You can also scale up. So if you need to have a machine that's bulked up for the end of month processing, you can spin it up so it's got 8 CPUs, and then after the fact, you can scale it back down. And Phil touched on all the security that we put in place to make sure that the user accessing a corporate machine inside your data center is completely locked down. And reliability is big in anything that AWS does. So Workspace is a reliable solution. It's across multiple availability zones. And Phil actually has wrote a great blog article about how you design and implement Workspaces to ensure that you make use of all our availability. I'll quickly stop there to see if there's any questions that have popped up. So Craig's asking, it looks like there is a desktop client for Android and can be used for Chrome OS Chromebooks. Do you know if there's any functional limitations on the client compared to the Mac clients or Windows client? Great question, Craig. One thing to note, and I'll let Phil answer if there's any limitations between the two. One of our customers, who we are currently trying to create a reference for, has rolled out Chromebook for their user base. So they've rolled out 2,500 or close to 2,500 users using Chromebook. So they use the Chromebook. They use the Chrome for SaaS-based apps, and when they need a Windows instance, they'll log into a Windows virtual desktop. So they do that for their whole entire fleet. They were about at 1,000 before the current situation hit, but then they rolled out Chromebooks for everybody else. Phil, is there anything that you know of from a client limitation perspective?
Yeah, there's a couple of things just to be aware of, and worth just experimenting if this is of interest to you. But there are 2 things that is a challenge. So the first one is key mappings. Chromebooks don't have things like a start key, and some of the Control-C, Control-V type of key mappings don't really work with an Android-based solution as well. So they're the ones that you just need to be aware of. There are a few things you can do to tweak some of those keyboard mappings, both on the local Chromebook itself and within the workspace to make that perhaps a better experience for your end user. So it depends as to what they're used to. If the end user is used to not having those keys, there's no problem. But if they're used to having those devices, a Windows device, and you're changing it to a Chromebook, then you do need to have a look at those key mappings. And the only other one, real quick, is multi-monitors. With Windows and Mac, we can fully support multi-monitors. But with Chromebooks, it's an interesting discussion point as to how applications are actually put into the memory. Each screen contains its own memory bank for a Chromebook operating system, and you can't share the same memory space across different screens at the same time. So there's some intricacies around making that work. A product team are working on that though, and trying to see if they can make that better longer term.
Thanks, Phil. Hopefully that answered your question, Craig. Again, feel free to pop in more questions as we go through. So one of the key things, and we talked about the pay-as-you-go model. What we saw during the last few months was people deploying workspaces in parallel to their current working from home solution. So they were building the capability that could scale up as required because they only pay for what you use. There's no complex licensing model. There's no capex of hardware. You pay for only what you use. They built a small platform that they could enable. And what they found was that they actually consumed workspaces quickly. And they saw the scale on the user experience. So they went from, we had a customer First Mac whose customer is referenceable, had 30 workspaces and then scaled up to 400 workspaces across Australia and the Philippines quicker than they were going to do. And they did not use their other working from home solutions. They enabled workspaces because they found a more secure, a great customer experience. And they know they can scale down as required if once everybody's back in the office without any lock-in fees or charges. So they're the two key takeaways is that we don't have any licensing costs or no long-term contracts required to use workspaces. Phil touched on this, but we just thought it's a great representation. So it is a managed service, and as you can see from an on-prem VDI solution, our customers would be responsible for hardware, which is the network server storaging required. There's some software that overlays it, a hypervisor of some sort, and then you have your admins that are managing all the hardware plus all the imaging. People have moved VDI onto AWS, so we support VDI on AWS so that we take care of the hardware, but you're still responsible for the software required to run your VDI platform, as well as administration costs. In AWS, our solution, we take care of all the hardware, so you don't have to worry about capacity or planning capacity or any of the performance issues. We've got different capabilities in that space. We take care of all the software for you and all the administration up until the OS. So from a customer perspective, they have to manage the OS and above. And our simplest conversation we have with our customers is that you're building a new branch office. That branch office just happens to be in the cloud. It's plugged into your security in your environment. We take care of everything for you. You just have to take care of the OS and continue to use the current system management tools to do that. But we gave the capabilities, as Phil puts it, an API so that you can then do some great enhancements, which could be using voice activation to deploy more workspaces, having a user request an upgrade and go through to your service management tool for approval without any user interaction. So as a user, I can request an upgrade to a larger machine. It gets a ticket gets logged into your ServiceNow. If you're using ServiceNow, it goes to your manager for approving the cost, and without anybody having to touch anything, that provision, that increase is given to that user. These are some of the enhancements that we see once people start deploying workspaces and making use of it as an API and not managing and enhancing how they manage an end user computing environment.
There is one question there from Craig that's just popped in around CloudFormation coverage for workspaces. So I'll answer that real quick. Yes, there is full support for CloudFormation for workspaces. And this is an interesting discussion point around how you deploy workspaces. My question is, why would you want to deploy workspaces with CloudFormation, given it's so granular and integrated with other things? The better play for scaling workspaces and easily automating this stuff is, as Richard said, to either integrate through like a ITSM platform, so as they're onboarded or the users onboarded into the company, as part of their provisioning workflow that they're issued on Workspace as part of their corporate issue. The other way that we see customers doing this at scale is just setting up an AD group. So add users to the AD group, and as they're added, there's a PowerShell script and a Lambda function behind the scenes that goes off and creates that user on Workspace. So it's easier to manage and maintain. If you're doing this in CloudFormation, it's actually harder to be as granular because you're dropping in a user perhaps at a time, or deleting a user and a workspace rather than a fleet of workspaces, which is a different discussion point. So I encourage you not to think about it that way. I think about it as provisioning a user and a workspace and integrate it within your existing workflows.
So, Phil, just while I was looking at the answers, there was a comment made on the chat about internet connection speed and connection. I don't think we touched on kind of how, I know.
Oh, yep.
So maybe you can touch on that a little bit. That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. As I kind of mentioned, and I know we're in some interesting times with internet congestion in terms of everyone's at home, everyone's hammering their local ISPs, which are a home internet carriage. West, just quick call out, one of our largest customers in region happens to be in New Zealand. Those users are actually all running predominantly off 4G connections, which is an interesting scenario. In terms of bandwidth and latency recommendations and requirements, latency, anything up to about 200 to 250 milliseconds latency is where we start to become problematic, or where we start to see problems introduced. New Zealand back to Australia is well less than that, so that shouldn't be a discussion point. The second piece is just around what are the bandwidth requirements for workspaces, and that does depend as to what you're doing in a workspace. If you think about it as we're pushing down pixels that change, and we're only pushing down the pixel that changes, not the whole desktop. If your user is in email, Word, PowerPoint, that kind of stuff where pixels are not changing at a rapid pace, the bandwidth requirements are considerably lower. When I did a baseline of myself a few weeks back, I was sitting at around an average for the whole day of about 15 kilobits per second. So that's not huge. Obviously, as I minimize or maximize a screen, obviously there's a higher jump of the number of pixels that need to change. And so my bandwidth or throughput also increases at the same time. On the extreme end of that, if your user is running like high-end workflow, 3D, I've seen a user do some really cool fluid dynamics where every pixel on the screen was changing all the time, and that was a 4K screen, so it's super high resolution screen. This is my personal record. I've never seen anybody beat this, and that was around 25 megabits per second throughput. So I would expect that would be a very unusual situation to be. Not all users are going to be doing that. I would say that the best answer I can give you is we should be working with you to test and validate what your real requirements are. But the general guidance is anywhere from that 50 kilobits per second up to a couple of megabits per second for an average type of user. So I hate answering questions with it depends, but that is purely, it is a depends answer.
Cool. But just the poll. Interesting to see, like 63% enabled BYOD on the call. I'd love to hear how they did BYOD. Was it, logging via VPN or a VDI solution or things like that? And the ones that didn't, how did you cope with the ones that didn't have a laptop already, or did everybody in your organization have a laptop? One of the things that we saw with some of our customers saying, well, now that we have enabled this and everybody's got home, how do we patch it? How do we do patching and updates? How do we ensure that our PCs are secure? Excuse me, sorry. So we have to make sure our users log into VPN so that we can roll out patches. These are some of the questions that people are starting to ask. Excuse me, it's got something in my throat. Sorry about that.
Do you want to hop in?
Yeah, all good now. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. That's cool.
It'd be interesting to follow up too around the policies and procedures and technology. I think a lot of organisations were pleasantly surprised, and I think a lot of IT teams actually got praised for how they handled this situation and getting people up and running. I think across Australia, it was really well received how quick IT responded to this, and all our customers said that IT really stepped up and provided them solutions. I think it's now the next phase of what does it look like long term, and how do we continue to run remote working or enable remote working. Just wanted to quickly share with you guys some of our customers just to to share. As you can see, we have customers across the board using Workspaces, uh, everything from large enterprise to mid-market and universities and government agencies across the globe making use of Workspaces. Just wanted to share some logos so that you can see the breadth of different organizations. It's not a vertically aligned product. Yeah, we're happy to take live questions too if anybody wants to raise their hand, and happy for Phil and I or anybody else to we can answer any questions if people want to raise their hand and talk directly. Another question came in by the looks of it. Is there any plans for Amazon to place a data center in New Zealand? Phil?
Look, apologies, guys. So I know no plans. I know of no plans. So again, for the end user compute portfolio, latency is not a thing. We have very large customers, and I'll name drop them because they presented at a number of summits for us. The New Zealand Department of Conservation, again, they have staff out in the field, many thousands of staff in their field. Both office workers, but then the dudes in the log cabins that are making sure that the forests are in good health. They are literally in log cabins tethered to a 4G network, and they are connected to their Amazon Workspace as their corporate desktop environment. So latency is not a thing for the AWS End User Compute solutions. Hope that helps to answer that question. There's another question that Craig just popped up with saying, do you know if you can run VS Code on Amazon 2+ Mate? I'm assuming that's Visual Studio Code. So as long, and apologies, I don't know the direct answer to that, but as long as it runs in Linux, you should be good to go. You should just be able to test it. And if you wanted to reach out to us directly, happy to help you if you're struggling to get it up and running. I was actually just going to say real quick. So we ran, it was a couple of years back now, but we ran a really good boot camp in Sydney. And our attendees were surprised at how fast they could launch a virtual desktop using Workspaces within about 45 minutes. And it wasn't laborious. It's just a bunch of clicks and then a little bit of wait time as part of that 45 minutes to actually launch stuff behind the scenes. But just make sure, if you wanted to test something, like test the VS Code or Visual Studio Code inside Linux, Amazon Linux for Workspaces, taking about 45 minutes if you wanted to run through and get that done. If you're a new user to Workspaces, when you log into the AWS Management Console and go to Workspaces, there is actually an Express Setup button that you can press. It involves a next. This is the username, like type the username scenario and type the email address. And within 45 minutes, you will have a fully functional workspace environment where you can go and test some of this stuff. So please don't think about it as a highly laborious exercise if you wanted just to experiment with this. But again, please reach out to us if you've got any further questions or problems we can help you with.
There's a question in the chat about what's the view on how small and medium enterprise will use Amazon Workspaces. I've not looked at the pricing or any other stuff, but just curious. So because we don't differentiate whether you deploy 1 or 1,000, there's no sort of price break. All our pricing is publicly listed on our website. What we've seen from our customer base is if you're running a Windows 10 instance, they use a power model or power config, which is about $51 USD per user per month, which is always on. So our customers, we've got small customers deploying 10 to 20 to large enterprises deploying thousands of them across the world. So it depends on the use case and how they find it. But if you take away, if you enable BYOD, enable Workspaces, there's a good use case for how that would work and how cost effective it could be. Hope that answers that question. We have, I think, is it like a minute left or 2 minutes?
There's one more question in the Q&A section from Andrew.
Oh, yeah. Andrew, does Workspace have public endpoints for whitelisting on external services? So yes, absolutely. So the first thing to mention is the Workspaces endpoints are public endpoints only. There does not exist a private endpoint for a Workspace, so they're public endpoints. If you don't like the fact that they're public endpoints, you can lock it down. So you can, through IP address whitelisting, you can restrict the IP addresses or the public IPs that can connect both to authenticate and then stream the traffic over. So you can restrict that if you want to, but by default, it is public endpoint and it accepts a connection from anywhere on any device. Solution on either EC2 or back on premise and route that traffic back on premise to the direct connect. So there's a few different options there.
We'll just wrap up now because I've just